Hi, I am Guy Banner. I'm a horticulturist here at Red Butte Garden. This is the water conservation garden. We have here Lindsay Nielsen, also a horticulturist, and Emily Allworth, also a horticulturist here. And we're going to plant a Texas redbud. The variety name is Oklahoma. These are a beautiful spring blooming tree. You can see some of the flowers beginning right now, edible flowers actually. It's a plant in the bean family. They get beautiful kidney-shaped leaves that are a bit leathery, and it's more drought tolerant than the typical redbud that you see, and has a nice compact shape. We're replacing one of these that was damaged by our hurricane force winds last year that broke off a really big branch, and we're glad to be getting one of these beautiful trees back in the ground.
Okay, so there's a few steps with planting a tree. We've got a couple of extenuating circumstances here. We're on a slope. We're planting a balled and burlap tree instead of a containerized tree or a bare root tree. So we're going to be talking about that in particular. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to move the tree to near where we want to plant it. And one thing that we want to consider is no matter what kind of tree you're moving, we never want to put too much pressure on the trunk. So we always want to grab it by the root system, the root ball, and the packaging that's around it. So that's an important thing to consider when you're moving the tree into place. Preparing the tree to be planted. And that includes taking off all of its packaging, as much packaging as we can get off above the root system. So that's anything wrapping the trunk, any kind of tags, nursery tags, things like this. We no longer need these things. And the next thing that we want to do here, especially with balled and burlap, is we want to kind of see what it is that we're working with. And the only way that we can do that is to kind of peel back some of this packaging, the burlap and the metal cage that is around it.
The burlap is often either nailed or stapled in, so be careful as you're working sharp metal.
So this root ball is looking pretty good. It's pretty well intact. You can see at this point where the trunk is flaring into the roots. The next step is we just want to find and uncover the main root system. Sometimes you'll get little feeder roots in these top bits. What we're looking for when we're doing this is roots that are at least the size of a pencil. So I've uncovered right here, you know, this main root branch here that's coming out. It looks pretty good. We've got a couple little pencil-sized ones here, and on this side a couple of pencil-sized ones here as well. So this looks pretty great. This is a good example of a root that is coming back upon itself. So the thing that we're looking for here with the root girdling or potential girdling roots, or why it happens, is in a nursery setting, these are often in containers, and what happens is the root reaches out to find its, the nutrients that it needs in the soil, and it'll run into the side of the pot and turn back on itself. And so we just want to make sure that the tree knows it can keep going out rather than come back into itself. We've done a good job in preparing the tree, and sometimes that, if you're planting a containerized plant, you would actually pull everything off here and you'd look at the roots all the way around. And sometimes that means teasing out the roots around the sides and also the bottom of the container. We're not as worried about that with a balled and burlap tree. When they pull it out of the ground, it tends to cut off a lot of those roots. So we're going to try, our worry here is just to keep this root ball as intact as possible. So the second thing, after we've prepared the plant, is to prepare the planting hole. And these guys have already got a pretty good start on this. So the next thing that we want to do is measure how deep this hole should be. Generally, you can use a measuring tape at this stage. You can use a piece of string. Another way is just to use a shovel, you know, get a good idea of the level by doing just that. And so we're pretty good on the level here. I might take just a little bit of soil out of that bottom bit, and then we'll muscle it in. The other thing that we want to think about is the width of the hole. We are planting into a pretty modified soil, so I don't think that we're not having to dig out quite so wide. If we were going into a native soil, we might want to amend the soil, we might need to go a little bit wider. But for this tree into this soil, the soil that's here is pretty good and fluffy, and so we're not too worried about it hitting into something too hard and compacted. So we've gone about 2 times what the root ball width is, and that should be good. So this is a pretty big tree. It's going to take all of us to muscle it in. So we want to be as careful with our backs as possible. So we want to talk about which side we want the tree to be facing which part. There's a lot of things to consider here. One is that nurseries will often mark the side of the bark that is facing the sun in the nursery. Sun scald is definitely an issue here up in the water conservation garden, and so we want to be mindful of that. So another thing that we want to think about when we're planting is doing any minimal pruning. We want to look for branches that are going to cross into the canopy, and we want to look for any deadwood, and especially any competing leaders. We want to be really careful here at planting because this is such a stressful time for the tree. So we want to keep our pruning as minimal as we can. Okay, so now that we've got this tree put in its new home, we just want to make sure that it's exactly aligned the way that we want it to be. So we turn it around, like we said, thinking about the canopy and the exposure, and now we need to make sure that it's straight. And we do that by stepping back and from various vantage points looking for plumpness. We're not just looking at the trunk, we're looking at the overall. This tree is actually pretty straight and it's got a really strong leader, so this is a pretty easy one to do. Sometimes you have them and they're a little more wonky, and so you just want to look at the overall tree, but you can always prune for straightness, except for the trunk. So you want to really pay attention to the trunk. Okay, so we like how this looks. We are a little bit deep here, but we're going to be backfilling and modifying the soil around it that we've been pulling out. Since we're on a slope, we have a little bit room to play with that. All right, so we'll start the backfill. And we want to do this fairly slow and get it nice and compacted underneath so that when the soil settles, we don't mind it settling on the top, but the underneath settling can be a little bit harder to predict.
So in this case, we have quite a bit of slope that we're working with in other plantings, and we wanted to keep the root base level with the downslope side, but to avoid any issues with potential rot by having too much soil accumulate next to the root base here, we may fill in with some sand, like fast draining sand or gravel in the soil to help move the water down past this and keep it from holding on to too much moisture and potentially rotting.
So since we're planting on a slope, we're just creating a little channel here to slow the water down as it's coming down this way. This will, with time, even itself out.
Here in the water conservation garden, we use drip irrigation in most of our beds. This is a really great way of using less water to water plants that might have the more water needs with other irrigation methods. So drip irrigation, you can see here, are tubes, and they have little holes in them that allow the water to perforate underneath the ground and specifically water areas that are planted without water evaporation from the surface level. So each time you use a sprayer or a hose, you're losing water to evapotranspiration, and this eliminates this. For this planting of a tree, we made sure to keep a wide barrier around and not have any drip irrigation get damaged with our use of shovels. So just going in softly and keeping a barrier around and identifying where our drip was and working around it. We then created room for a tree ring, which will eventually go around the base of this tree. That's going to allow for water to be directly around the base of the tree, giving the tree a little bit more water than some of the other perennials in the bed, as it tends to need more water. It's a bigger plant, and it can even steal water from other plantings if it's not getting enough. So we like to make sure our trees are well taken care of. Here at Red Butte, our underground drip irrigation, we like to usually use these types of zip ties to close the drip irrigation when we're working with them. So this right here is a closed one. This makes sure that we don't get soil while we're moving things around into the drip irrigation, which could then clog future points for drip emission. This here is unclipped, and we will be attaching that to a larger ring that will go around this tree and create that tree ring we talked about earlier. That way we can ensure that the tree is well watered, well taken care of, and will have a long and happy life.
So the last step in our planting of the tree is to water it. We're just going to water it into place. We're going to do this pretty slow. This is a fairly long process. We want to make sure the water totally permeates to the bottom of this hole, get rid of any air pockets, and that way we know if we need to add more soil back to the hole. All right, so now that we've got this all planted and tucked into its new home, we are going to water it. We've watered it already quite a bit. We're going to keep a pretty close eye on water for the next little while. It's in a pretty heavy soil, so the water is taking a while to to permeate this soil, and we want to allow that to really get down deep. We may need to add soil as this settles. The other thing that we wanted to talk about is sort of our finishing touches. Rather than coming with a chemical fertilizer right off the bat, we like to put a natural mulch compost on the top as a top dressing. This will help feed the plant. With time, it'll eventually turn into soil itself. You never want to put more than 2 to 3 inches of mulch on top of all of the modified soil, and you never want that mulch to, like Emily said, touch the bark at all, but especially not make a volcano at
No mulch volcanoes.
No mulch volcanoes. The other thing that we just wanted to touch on is a lot of people ask about staking their plants. It's better not to stake your plant. Pay attention to your soil types. If you absolutely have to stake your plant, pay attention to why it is that you're staking it. So is the root ball unstable? Sometimes sandy soils, a root ball will be unstable. If you have to stake for that reason, you want to keep your stake two to three stakes out away from the drip line of the tree. And you want to use a material like rubber or nylon low on the plant. And you never want to leave that assistance there for more than a couple of years. 1 year should be enough. So if your trunk is really flexible and is flexing in the wind and you need to stake for that reason, then you want to stake high. And you only want to do that against the wind. 1 stake should be enough, and really loosely. You never want it to be too, in any staking situation, you never want your material to be tight around the trunk of the plant.
Also, whatever material you use, don't use something that's super narrow and hard. So as Lindsay was saying, like either using rubber or cloth, but a wide strap is better than a very narrow one, because the narrow one will concentrate the pressure on the bark and do damage.
Yeah, and with the staking, you're only trying to provide assistance in a windy situation, essentially. You really do want to let your plant figure out its home, and it will create roots to help it stand against the wind naturally. And you don't want to alter that in any way by assisting it with stakes unnaturally.
Happy Arbor Day!